The deeper you go into the wilderness, the more you start to feel like the last person on earth. It's a quiet that presses in on you, that swallows every sound and makes the world seem endless and empty. That's what I love about hiking, disappearing into the vastness, where roads and crowds and cell signals don't exist. But after this trip, I realized that being alone out there isn't always a good thing. It was early fall in Oregon, and I was deep into a solo hiking trip. I had been on the trail for 2 days without seeing another soul, and by this point, I was roughly 15 miles from the nearest road. The chill in the air kept most people away, but I had the right gear for it. Layers, a small tent, enough food, and a reliable map. That morning, I made a quick cup of coffee over my little camp stove, packed up my gear, and set out for my next campsite about 5 miles away. For hours into my hike, the silence of the forest was interrupted by the sound of footsteps ahead of me. I looked up and saw a man walking toward me from the opposite direction. He looked rough, scruffy beard, worn-out hiking pants, a long-sleeved shirt that looked like it had seen better days. But what caught my attention wasn't his appearance. It was what he wasn't carrying. No backpack, no water bottle, nothing. Just a man, alone, wandering deep into the wilderness with no supplies. As we passed each other, I gave him a polite nod, but something about him made me uneasy. And then, as I took a few more steps, I felt it, that instinctual nudge, that primal warning. I glanced back over my shoulder. He was looking back at me, too. I quickly turned away, trying not to overthink it. Maybe he had a campsite nearby. Maybe he was just out for a short walk. But I knew, deep down, that there weren't any designated campsites in this area. The trail wasn't exactly well-traveled, and the nearest town was too far for someone to just be wandering without supplies. Still, I kept moving, pushing the thought out of my mind. By the time I reached my campsite, I was exhausted. It wasn't the most scenic spot, just a small clearing surrounded by dense trees with barely a glimpse of the mountains beyond. I set up my tent and sat down to rest, watching the last bits of sunlight filter through the branches. That's when I heard it, the sound of shuffling footsteps behind me. I turned, and my stomach dropped. It was him, the same man from the trail. He still wasn't carrying any gear, and what unsettled me the most was how he had gotten here. He had been walking in the opposite direction when I saw him hours ago. For him to be here now, he would have had to turn around and follow me at some point. He walked straight into my campsite without acknowledging me, as if I didn't even exist. He sat down on the ground about 10 feet away. No tent, no sleeping bag, just sitting there, staring into the trees. Now that I could get a better look at him, he seemed to be in his late 30s, with sharp, sunken features. There was something unnatural about his stillness, like he was waiting for something, watching. The sun was dipping lower, and my unease was growing. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he lost? On something? Or was this intentional? I couldn't afford to wait and find out. I decided I wouldn't be staying here tonight. As I began packing up my tent, I glanced over at him. That's when he finally looked at me. And once his eyes locked onto me, he didn't look away. Every time I glanced back, his gaze was still on me, unblinking. I secured my pack and threw it over my shoulders, forcing myself to stay calm. As I took my first step away from the campsite, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. He had stood up. I walked as quickly as I could, gripping the small knife I kept on my belt. At first, I only heard the sounds of my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. Then I heard another set. He was following me. I didn't run, not yet. I kept moving, picking up my pace, hoping that he'd stop, that maybe I was just imagining things. But after a few minutes, I stole another glance over my shoulder. He was still there. That was it. I veered off the trail, straight into the woods, hoping he wouldn't notice. I crouched behind a tree, pressing myself against the rough bark, trying to control my breathing. His footsteps slowed. Then, he stopped. I saw his shadowed figure standing on the trail, scanning the trees. He knew I was nearby. Then, in a disturbingly friendly tone, he called out, "Hey, you all right? Need help finding your way back?" I didn't move. He called out again, his voice unnervingly casual, as if we were just two hikers having a friendly conversation. "Come on, man. It's getting dark. Not safe to be out here alone. I clenched my knife tighter, willing myself to stay silent. Then, after a long pause, he did something that sent ice down my spine. He stepped off the trail, not in my direction, but into the trees on the opposite side. He wasn't leaving. He was hiding, waiting. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. No footsteps, no rustling, just the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears. I stayed crouched behind that tree for over an hour, long after the last light had faded from the sky. When I was sure he was gone, I forced myself to move, making my way carefully back to the trail. I hiked through the night, pushing myself to skip the next campsite entirely. When I finally made it back to town, exhausted and shaken, I went straight to the police station. I told them everything. They took down my report, nodding and scribbling notes, but I could tell they weren't going to do much. Probably just some drifter, one of them said. If he gave you trouble, he's long gone now. But I knew better. That man wasn't just some drifter. He wasn't lost. He wasn't looking for help. He had been watching, waiting. And I don't even want to think about what would have happened if I had stayed at that campsite a minute longer. So what do you think? Was he living out there, hunting for an easy target? Or was there something even worse going on? Would you have confronted him, or done what I did and gotten out as fast as possible? I used to believe that time could bury the past, that the things we did when we were young, mistakes, impulsive decisions, and reckless choices, would fade into nothing more than distant memories. I thought I had outrun mine. I was wrong. It started over 12 years ago, back when I was just a kid trying to escape a home that never felt like one. My mom had a habit of letting the wrong men into our lives, and her latest mistake was Steve, a guy who had nothing going for him but a short temper and a need to control everything. I was 15, angry, and desperate for a place where I could breathe without feeling like I was walking on broken glass. That place, for me, was the woods across the street. I don't remember the first time I wandered in, only that once I did, I never wanted to leave. The trees became my walls, the wind through the branches my comfort. I found a small clearing surrounded by towering cedar trees, a hidden sanctuary where the world couldn't reach me. I built my own little clubhouse there, a place where I could disappear whenever I needed to, and I needed to a lot. My parents barely noticed when I started spending nights out there. At first, I tried bringing supplies from home, but they always went missing, either stolen by my mom's boyfriends or lost in the chaos of our house. So, I came up with a new plan. I knocked on doors, offering to mow lawns for cash. I'd never touched a lawnmower before, but that didn't stop me. When I finally saved up enough, I bought a rundown, second-hand mower of my own and kept working until I had enough money to buy some basic camping gear from an old surplus store. That's how I survived my teenage years. I barely went to school, only showing up enough to keep myself out of trouble, and every spare moment was spent in the woods. I thought I had everything figured out. Then, one day, the woods stopped being just mine. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had been camping all weekend and was on my way to the creek for water when I spotted something strange. Across the water, parked on a deserted road, was an old camper. Two men stood outside it, talking and drinking, completely unaware of my presence. Something about them made me uneasy, but I told myself they were just passing through. Hours later, when I returned, they were still there. This time, they weren't just drinking, they were shooting. I heard the gunshots before I saw them, and when I did, I realized they weren't just firing at the trees. They were aiming at random, careless, laughing like it was all a joke. Then, a bullet hit the water near me. Rage flooded through me. This was my place, my only escape, and these men were ruining it. I didn't think. I just ran home, picked up the phone, and called the sheriff. I should have left it at that, but anger got the best of me. I lied. I told them the men had threatened me, that they pointed their guns at me and warned me to stay quiet. It was a stupid, reckless decision, but I wanted them gone. The next morning, I woke up to a news report. A major drug bust. The sheriff, acting on an anonymous tip, had found two men running a mobile meth lab inside that camper. They were both arrested on the spot. I remember staring at the screen, my stomach twisting with a feeling I couldn't name. Relief? Fear? Maybe both. For a while, I convinced myself that was the end of it. Then, 3 months before their sentencing, I received a letter. No return address. Just a short message scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You messed with the wrong people, kid." A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was a coincidence, a prank, something that had nothing to do with me, until the second letter arrived. "You better hope we get time served." I stopped sleeping after that. I barely left my woods, convinced that if I stayed hidden, they wouldn't find me. But as the months passed and nothing happened, I started to believe I had been paranoid. The judge sentenced both men to 20 years. I told myself it was over. For a decade, I lived my life like the letters had never come. I moved out of my hometown, built a life, found love. I had a girlfriend, a newborn son, and an apartment that finally felt like home. The past was just a story I sometimes told myself in the dark. Then, last week, another letter arrived. "You better write a will. The end is near." I dropped it the second I read it. My breath caught in my throat. My girlfriend picked it up, reading it over with wide eyes. I tried to laugh it off, say it was nothing, just a dumb prank. But my hands were shaking. How had they found me? How long had they been watching? Had they been waiting all this time, biding their time until they could finish what they started? Or had I just convinced myself I was safe when, all along, I wasn't? Now, I check the locks 3 times before I go to bed. I glance over my shoulder every time I step outside. My girlfriend doesn't know the truth, not all of it. But she can see the fear in my eyes, and that's enough. I thought about going to the police, but what can they do? Without proof, without a face, it's just an empty threat on paper. So, I'm left with the question that haunts me. Is this just another scare tactic? Or is the past finally catching up to me? What would you do if you knew someone was coming for you, but had no idea when? The summer of 2006 was supposed to be like any other. Just another hike through familiar trails, another escape into the wilderness where the world felt quieter, simpler. The drive to the national park was smooth, the kind that lulled you into a sense of normalcy. I parked near the visitor center, checked in with the ranger as I always did, and set off on the 2-mile trek to my usual campsite. But this trip would be different. This time, someone's life had unraveled in the wilderness, and fate had decided that I would be the one to find them. My love for the outdoors wasn't something I had always possessed. It was born from grief. After the September 11th attacks, I lost someone who had once meant everything to me. We had been college sweethearts, drifted apart, and then reconnected thanks to the magic of the internet. We had plans to meet that Thanksgiving, to see if the love we once had could be rekindled. But before that could happen, she was gone. Just like that. The loss sent me spiraling. I packed a bag one day, hiked deep into the woods, and fully intended never to leave. But standing on the edge of my own despair, I was struck by something unexpected. The rustling trees, the crisp air, the sky stretching endlessly above me. It reminded me that life, even in its pain, was still beautiful. That realization saved me. And so the wilderness became my refuge, my way of making sense of the senseless. That summer morning in 2006, I woke with the sunrise, stretched in the cool air, and decided to explore the canyons. These hikes had become treasure hunts of sorts. Now and then, I would stumble upon arrowheads or small artifacts, reminders of lives that had passed through these lands long before mine. It was almost midday when something unusual caught my eye. A flash, a glint of light reflecting off something far below. At first, I thought it was just the sun hitting a rock, but then another flicker came, more deliberate this time. I narrowed my eyes, scanning the cliffside. That's when I saw them. Arms, waving. 50 feet down the rocky slope, barely visible through the brush, someone was moving. My pulse quickened. Without thinking, I scrambled down the trail to get a better look. As I hopped onto a ledge, the ground beneath me gave way. The fall felt eternal. Then, impact. The landing wasn't as brutal as I had feared, but pain jolted through my back. I lay still for a second, catching my breath, before the urgency of the situation hit me again. I tried to push myself up, but realized my left foot was wedged tightly between 2 rocks. Panic swelled in my chest. I pressed down on the upper rock, twisted my ankle just right, and finally yanked myself free. Limping forward, I spotted her. She was lying on her side, motionless at first, but as I got closer, her lips twitched. Then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open. "I thought you were gone," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. When I saw the rock slide, she tried to smile, but it barely formed. Her skin was pale, and her breaths were shallow. "You're not a bother," I said quickly, kneeling beside her. "You need water." I reached into my pack, pulled out my battered water bottle, and held it to her lips. She drank in small sips, each one seeming to bring a little more life back to her face. Between pauses, she told me her story. She had been hiking alone, exploring off-trail, when the ground beneath her collapsed. She had been stranded for nearly 2 days, injured, dehydrated, and growing weaker by the hour. I knew we didn't have much time. "I'm going to get help," I told her. She nodded, her exhaustion taking over as I covered her with my fleece jacket. The climb back up was grueling. Every step sent pain shooting through my body, but I forced myself forward. By the time I reached the ranger station, I could barely speak. I didn't need to. One look at me, and they knew. Within minutes, a rescue team was assembled. The next few hours blurred together. I was taken to a hospital to be checked out, my body exhausted and bruised from the fall. As I lay in a hospital bed, still processing everything, I saw them wheel her in. Her condition was worse than I had imagined. A punctured lung, a broken arm, severe dehydration, but she was alive. That night, she was rushed into surgery. I waited in silence, watching the seconds stretch into eternity. Then, finally, the news came. She would recover. Her name was Shannon, and in the months that followed, we stayed in touch. She told me about her recovery, how her family had flown in to be by her side, how she had started to see life differently. In time, she moved to Montana, got married, and built a life of her own. I never told her how much she had saved me, too. The wilderness had been my sanctuary, my escape. But that day, it became something more. It became a reminder that we're never truly alone, that sometimes fate intervenes in ways we can't predict. And I still wonder, what if I had chosen a different trail that day? What if I had ignored that glint of light? Would she still be here? Some things are impossible to know, but I like to believe that, somehow, the universe led me to that canyon, to that moment, for a reason. What do you think? Do moments like these happen by chance? Or is there something more guiding us? There's something about the woods that distorts time. A moment can stretch into eternity, a peaceful hike can turn eerie in an instant, and sometimes, a friendly face can become the last thing you'd ever want to see again. It was early spring of last year, right after the lockdown restrictions in our area had finally lifted. My husband Chris and I were eager to get back to something that had always grounded us, hiking. Before we got married, we used to go on weekend hikes all the time, often camping overnight at different spots. It had been a while since we'd done that, and I was excited to relive those moments with him. The plan was simple: hike up to a lake nestled deep in the reserve, camp for the night, and hike back in the morning. The weather was perfect: clear skies, warm air, and dry trails. What made it even better was the fact that we hardly saw anyone on the trail that day. It was peaceful, the kind of solitude we had been craving. Around midday, we stopped at a designated rest area halfway to the lake. There were picnic tables, a fire pit, and a stunning view of the valley below. Another couple had already claimed one of the tables, so we asked if we could join them. They introduced themselves as newlyweds, celebrating their honeymoon with a camping trip. The husband, a tall guy with an easygoing attitude, did most of the talking. His wife was quieter but kind, and she listened with a smile as Chris, ever the romantic, told them our own love story. We ended up chatting with him for nearly 2 hours before finally parting ways. We reached the lake just before dusk, set up camp, and enjoyed a simple meal by the fire. It was peaceful, exactly as we had hoped. That night, as we lay in the tent, I fell asleep to the soft crackling of the dying embers and the distant call of an owl. At sunrise, I was the first to wake. I got the fire going while Chris started breaking down the tent. By 10 a.m., we were back on the trail, deciding to skip a break at the halfway point and head straight for the parking lot. That's when we saw him. The husband from the couple we'd met the day before was standing alone near the edge of the trail. Chris, being friendly as always, called out to him, asking where his wife was. The man hesitated, just for a moment, but then forced a quick smile. "Oh, she wasn't feeling well last night, so she decided to head home early," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Told me to go ahead and finish the trip on my own." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. His voice was too casual, too rehearsed. He wasn't making eye contact, and his fingers were tapping against his thigh as if he was anxious to leave. But what struck me the most was his demeanor. He wasn't just nervous. He was jittery, like he had too much adrenaline running through his veins. Before we could ask more, a group of hikers appeared down the path. The man used the opportunity to excuse himself, heading toward them as if desperate to blend in. I wanted to say something to Chris, but he just shrugged. "It's not really our business," he murmured. "Maybe she really did just get sick." I nodded, though my gut was screaming otherwise. By the time we reached the parking lot, something felt off. There were more people than usual, some standing in small clusters, talking in hushed voices. A ranger's truck was pulling in, along with several other vehicles. We packed up our gear and drove off, not thinking much of it at the time. It wasn't until the next morning that the news hit. Chris was watching the morning news while I was making breakfast when I heard him suddenly choke on his coffee. "Babe, come look at this," he said, his voice tense. I walked over and froze. On the screen was the woman from the hike, her face smiling in a wedding photo, the same one we had met just 2 days earlier. The headline beneath her image read, "Hiker dies in tragic fall at scenic cliffside overlook." I felt my stomach drop. The news anchor went on to explain that according to her husband, they had been watching the sunrise together when she lost her footing and plummeted hundreds of feet to her death. I immediately thought back to the trail. Why hadn't he mentioned anything when we saw him? Why had he lied about her being sick? If she had fallen that morning, there should have been search teams, rangers, something. But there was nothing, just a jittery man eager to disappear. Chris and I spent the next hour going over the details, trying to make sense of it. It didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had spoken to a murderer. After much debate, we decided to call the sheriff's office. I explained everything, the conversation, his nervousness, the contradiction in his story. The deputy on the phone listened, asked a few questions, then put me on hold. When he returned, he simply said someone might contact us in the future. That was almost a year ago. No one ever followed up. No arrests were made. As far as we know, the case was closed. And now, I'm left with this gnawing feeling in my chest. Did we brush past a killer in the woods that day? Was it really just an accident? Or did a man get away with murder right under everyone's noses? Chris thinks we should let it go. The authorities have all the information, and if they didn't find anything suspicious, then maybe we're just overthinking it. But I don't know. I keep replaying that moment in my head. His jittery stance, the forced smile, the way he practically ran toward that group of hikers. It haunts me. So I'm asking you, strangers on the internet, what would you do? Would you push further? Or is this one of those things you have to let go, no matter how wrong it feels?